I handed my ex-wife the divorce settlement gift, then watched her face as she realized what it really meant. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have. I slid it across the mahogany conference table toward Diane, watching her manicured fingers reach for it with the same practiced elegance she'd used to sign our marriage certificate 9 years ago. Her attorney, Richard Thornton, sat beside her with the smug expression of a man who thought he'd already won. My lawyer, Patricia Nguyen, remained perfectly still to my left, her face unreadable. The fluorescent lights of the law office buzzed overhead, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as Diane's perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together in confusion. She pulled out the contents, and I watched the exact moment her brain tried to process what she was seeing. Her lips parted slightly, that tiny intake of breath before the storm. I'd waited 18 months for this moment, and God help me, I was going to savor every second of watching her world collapse. I should start at the beginning, back when I actually believed in the life we'd built together. My name is Austin Wells, and until 22 months ago, I thought I had it all figured out. I was a senior software architect at a tech firm in Seattle, pulling in a comfortable 6-figure salary. Diane worked as a marketing director for a boutique firm downtown, equally successful, equally driven. We lived in a beautiful craftsman house in Ballard, took annual trips to Italy, and hosted dinner parties where our friends would toast to us as the perfect couple. We'd been trying for kids for 3 years with no success, which had put strain on us, sure, but nothing I thought we couldn't handle. I believed in therapy, in communication, in working through problems like adults. I believed in a lot of things back then. The first crack appeared on a Wednesday evening in March. I came home early from work with a migraine, something that had been happening more frequently. I'd been attributing it to stress from a major project deadline, but my doctor had suggested it might be related to poor sleep. Diane's car was in the driveway, which surprised me since she usually worked until 7. I walked into our home office to grab some ibuprofen from the desk drawer, and her laptop was open, facing away from the door. I wasn't trying to snoop. I genuinely wasn't. But the screen was visible from where I stood, and I could see a message thread with someone named Jay, and the words, "Can't wait to feel you again," sitting right there in the preview pane. My stomach dropped, but I told myself I was misreading it. Context, right? Maybe it was an old friend. Maybe it was innocent. The migraine suddenly felt worse, and I grabbed the pills and left before she knew I was home. I spent the next week watching her differently, hating myself for it, but unable to stop. She'd come home at her usual time, kiss me on the cheek, ask about my day with what seemed like genuine interest. We made dinner together on Friday, watched a movie, made love that night with what I thought was real intimacy. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. But then I noticed she'd started keeping her phone face down on surfaces, something she'd never done before. She'd take calls in the other room, saying it was work drama she didn't want to bore me with. Little things, easy to rationalize individually, but they were adding up. One night, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I picked it up, and the preview showed a message from Dr. Jay Whitmore saying, "Same time Thursday, wear the blue dress." My hands started shaking as I set the phone back down exactly as I'd found it. Thursday came, and I told Diane I had to work late. Instead, I left the office at 3 in the afternoon and drove to a coffee shop 2 blocks from her office building. I felt like a stalker, like the jealous husband from some bad television drama, but I couldn't shake the gnawing certainty in my gut. At 5:30, she emerged from her building, but instead of heading to the parking garage, she walked 3 blocks east and entered an upscale hotel. She was wearing a blue dress I'd never seen before. I sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours, nursing cold espresso and feeling my marriage dissolve in real time. When she finally emerged at 7:40, her hair was different, slightly mussed, and she was walking with the satisfied ease of someone who'd just had a very good evening. I drove home, got there before her, and pretended to be working on my laptop when she arrived. She kissed my cheek, said her team meeting had run long, and asked if I wanted to order Thai food. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Because I'd learned something valuable in my career as a software architect. You don't react to bugs, you document them. You gather data, establish patterns, and only then do you develop a solution. So I started gathering data. I purchased a voice-activated recorder from Amazon and hid it in her car, tucked behind the passenger seat. I felt disgusting doing it, but the part of me that needed to know the truth was louder than my conscience. The first recording I listened to made me throw up in the kitchen sink. Her voice, breathless and excited, talking to someone about how I was completely clueless and how she'd never felt this alive. She talked about leaving me, but not yet. Not until the finances were properly arranged. The man's voice, Dr. Jay Whitmore, I assumed, laughed and said something about making sure she got what she deserved in the divorce. They'd been planning this for months. I made an appointment with Patricia Nguyen the following Monday. She came highly recommended as a divorce attorney who specialized in high-asset cases and had a reputation for being ruthless when necessary. Patricia was in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed, with steel gray hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that missed nothing. I sat in her office overlooking Elliott Bay and played her 3 of the recordings. She listened without expression, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook. When the recordings ended, she looked up at me and said, "How much proof do you want before you're ready to move forward?" I told her I wanted everything, every text, every meeting, every lie documented and time-stamped. She nodded slowly and said, "Then we're going to need some help. I know a private investigator who's very good at this sort of thing." That's how I met David Chen. Wait, I need to use a different name. That's how I met David Kowalski, a former police detective turned private investigator who'd spent 23 years working white-collar crime and infidelity cases. David was built like a fire hydrant, with a shaved head and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen everything humans were capable of and wasn't impressed by any of it. He sat across from me in a diner on a Saturday morning and listened to my story while working through a stack of pancakes. When I finished, he wiped his mouth, leaned back and said, "Your wife's not just having an affair, Mr. Wells. She's running a con. That comment about finances being properly arranged, she's setting you up for a divorce where she walks away with everything. The question is, do you want to just protect yourself, or do you want to make sure she pays for what she's done?" I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "Both," I said. David smiled for the first time, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "Good. Then here's what we're going to do." Over the next 6 months, David became a ghost in my life and Diane's. He documented everything. He discovered that Dr. J. Whitmore was actually Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, a married cosmetic surgeon with 3 children and a pristine reputation in Seattle's medical community. He photographed them entering hotels on 17 separate occasions. He obtained credit card receipts showing Diane had been using our joint account to pay for lingerie, dinners, and hotel rooms. He traced back their affair to a medical conference in Vancouver 14 months earlier, meaning she'd been lying to me for over a year. But the real goldmine came when he hacked into her email. Legally questionable, Patricia warned, but admissible if we were careful about how we presented it. The emails told a story that made my blood run cold. Diane and Jonathan had been planning my downfall like it was a business merger. She'd been transferring money from our joint accounts into a separate account I didn't know about, small amounts at first, then larger chunks disguised as charitable donations and business expenses. She'd been documenting instances where I'd supposedly been emotionally abusive, complete fabrications, but detailed enough that they'd sound convincing to a judge. She'd even consulted with a different attorney, Richard Thornton, about how to maximize her settlement by portraying herself as a neglected wife married to a workaholic husband who'd refused to address their fertility issues. The emails between her and Jonathan were particularly vicious. They joked about me, about how I was too trusting, too focused on my work to notice what was happening in my own marriage. In one email, she called me useful, but ultimately disposable. Reading those words broke something in me that I don't think will ever fully heal, but it also crystallized my resolve. Patricia and David helped me build a case that was airtight. We documented every fraudulent transfer, every lie, every instance of infidelity. But we didn't confront her. Not yet. Because Patricia had a different strategy in mind, one that would require patience and perfect timing. "She's planning to file for divorce in about 2 months, Patricia said, reading through the email chain where Diane and her attorney discussed their timeline. "She wants to do it right after your company's annual bonuses come through, so that income gets calculated into the settlement. What we're going to do is let her think she's winning, right up until the moment we pull the rug out." The next 2 months were the hardest of my life. I had to come home every evening and pretend I didn't know my wife was actively conspiring to destroy me. I had to smile when she smiled, make love to her when she initiated it, discuss our future like we actually had one together. I felt like I was acting in a play where only I knew the script was a tragedy. The migraines got worse, and my doctor prescribed stronger medication. I lost 15 pounds because eating felt impossible most days. My colleagues noticed I seemed off, but I blamed it on the project deadline. Only Patricia and David knew the truth, and they kept me focused on the end game. David continued his surveillance, and one Thursday evening he called me with news that made me want to put my fist through a wall. He'd followed Diane to a fertility clinic, where she'd had a consultation about egg freezing. She was planning a future with Jonathan, one that included the children she'd supposedly wanted with me. That same week, I had a session with my therapist, Dr. Anne Fairbanks, a clinical psychologist I'd been seeing since the migraines started. Anne was in her early 60s, with kind eyes and a voice that could make you feel safe enough to admit your darkest thoughts. I'd been dancing around the real issue for weeks, but finally, I told her everything. She listened, and when I finished, she said something that stuck with me. "Austin, what you're experiencing isn't just betrayal. It's a fundamental shattering of your reality. The life you thought you had never existed. You've been living in a fabrication, and now you have to grieve not just the loss of your marriage, but the loss of the past you thought you had." She was right. I wasn't just losing my wife. I was losing 9 years of memories that had all been tainted by her deception. The bonus came through on a Friday in late August, a substantial amount that pushed our joint account into territory that would make for an impressive settlement. That weekend, Diane was particularly affectionate, and I understood why. She thought she'd successfully positioned herself for the big payday. On Monday morning, she said she needed to talk to me that evening, that it was important. I knew what was coming. I told her I'd be home by 6. Instead, I went to Patricia's office at 4:30, and together we finalized our counter strategy. At 5:45, Patricia called Diane's attorney, Richard Thornton, and informed him that I was filing for divorce, effective immediately, on grounds of adultery and financial fraud. She emailed him a 90-page document that detailed every affair meeting, every fraudulent transfer, every incriminating email and text message. She also informed him that we'd be seeking full restitution of marital assets and pressing criminal charges for the unauthorized transfers. I got home at 6:05. Diane was in the kitchen, and she'd made dinner, pasta primavera, one of my favorites. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse and had her hair up the way I used to love. She smiled when I walked in, but I could see the nervousness behind it. She was about to drop a bomb and wasn't sure how I'd react. Before she could speak, I said, "We need to talk." She nodded, clearly thinking I was just echoing her own intention. We sat down at the dining table, and I pulled out a manila envelope of my own. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, watching her face carefully. She blinked, confused, then actually laughed. "Austin, I was going to—" I cut her off. "I know what you were going to do. I know about Jonathan. I know about the hotels, the money transfers, the emails. I know everything, Diane. And my attorney has already filed the paperwork." The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. I slid the envelope across the table. "Those are copies of the evidence we'll be presenting. I wanted you to see it before your attorney does, so you understand exactly how much trouble you're in." Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope and started reading. I watched her eyes move across the pages, saw the moment she realized the extent of what we'd documented. She looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "Austin, please, let me explain." I stood up. "There's nothing to explain. You made your choices, and now you get to live with the consequences. I'll be staying at a hotel tonight. My attorney will be in touch." I walked out of our house, got in my car, and drove away. My hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over after 2 blocks to collect myself. The legal battle that followed was brutal. Richard Thornton tried every trick in the book to discredit our evidence, but Patricia was better. She brought in forensic accountants who testified to the fraudulent transfers. She had David take the stand to detail his surveillance findings. She even got Jonathan's wife, Catherine Whitmore, to provide a deposition after Catherine discovered the affair through our evidence disclosure. Catherine was a poised woman in her early 40s who sat in that deposition room with the quiet fury of someone who'd just had her entire life upended. Her testimony was devastating, detailing how Jonathan had been lying to her for over a year, how he'd used their shared credit cards to fund his affair, how he'd promised Diane things that were never his to give. The judge, Honorable Linda Vasquez, a 20-year veteran of family court, listened to everything with an expression that suggested she'd seen this story play out 1,000 times, but was still disappointed by human nature. Diane's defense crumbled piece by piece. Her claims of emotional abuse were contradicted by our couple's therapist, Dr. Robert Finch, who testified that in all our sessions, I'd been consistently engaged and emotionally available, while Diane had been increasingly distant and evasive. Her financial claims were destroyed by the evidence of her secret account and unauthorized transfers, and her attempt to paint herself as a betrayed wife seeking freedom was obliterated by the sheer volume of evidence showing she'd been the architect of the entire deception. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and by the end, even Richard Thornton looked exhausted. On the final day, Judge Vasquez delivered her ruling, and it was everything Patricia had hoped for. I was awarded full restitution of all marital assets, including the money Diane had transferred to her secret account. Diane was ordered to pay my legal fees, which had reached into 6 figures, and because of the fraudulent transfers, the judge referred the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. But that wasn't the end of it. Because while the legal system was slowly grinding Diane into dust, her personal life was imploding in real time. Jonathan's wife filed for divorce within weeks of learning about the affair, and she wasn't as forgiving as the court system. She went to the medical board with evidence that Jonathan had been using his professional resources, including his office and staff, to facilitate his affair. The board launched an ethics investigation that resulted in a 6-month suspension of his medical license and a formal reprimand that would follow him for the rest of his career. His reputation in Seattle's medical community was destroyed. His partners at the cosmetic surgery practice bought him out at a fraction of what his stake was worth, effectively pushing him out of the business he'd spent 15 years building. Catherine took their children and moved to Portland to be near her family, taking with her half of everything Jonathan owned and a generous child support arrangement. Diane's life fell apart even faster. Her employer, upon learning of the scandal, including the fact that she'd been using company time and resources for personal matters, terminated her for violation of their ethics policy. Her professional reputation in Seattle's tight-knit marketing community was ruined, as word spread about the affair and the financial fraud. Friends we'd shared for years quietly stopped returning her calls, not wanting to be associated with the drama. Her own family, conservative Methodists from Indiana who'd raised her with strict values, were mortified and cut her off financially, refusing to help with her mounting legal bills. She moved into a small apartment in Renton, a far cry from our Craftsman in Ballard, and took a job as a marketing coordinator for a small startup at less than half her previous salary. I didn't take any joy in her suffering, but I won't pretend it didn't feel like justice. Through all of this, I was trying to rebuild my own life. Dr. Fairbanks continued to see me twice a week, helping me process the trauma and betrayal. She helped me understand that my grief was valid, that I was allowed to mourn the life I'd thought I had, even if it had been built on lies. I sold our house, too many bad memories, and bought a condo in Capitol Hill with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city. I threw myself into work, getting promoted to lead architect on a major project that kept me busy 70 hours a week. Some people might say I was avoiding dealing with my emotions, but the structure helped. It gave me a sense of control when everything else felt chaotic. My colleagues knew something had happened, but respected my privacy enough not to pry. My manager, Thomas Reeves, a software veteran in his 50s with 2 divorces under his own belt, pulled me aside one day and said, "Whatever you're going through, don't let it make you bitter. That's when they win." I appreciated the advice, even if I wasn't sure I could follow it. The criminal investigation into Diane's fraudulent transfers moved forward slowly, as these things do. The assistant district attorney assigned to the case, Michael Brennan, was a sharp prosecutor in his late 30s who specialized in financial crimes. He reached out to Patricia, who forwarded his contact information to me. We met for coffee one morning, and he walked me through what to expect. "The evidence is solid," he said, stirring his Americano. "But criminal trials are different from civil cases. We need to prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt, and a good defense attorney will argue she had access to the accounts and didn't realize what she was doing was illegal." I asked him if he thought they'd actually prosecute. He looked at me seriously and said, "Mr. Wells, your ex-wife stole over $85,000 from joint accounts and attempted to hide it. That's felony theft. Yes, we're prosecuting." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday in November, 8 months after I'd walked out of our house. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom with Patricia beside me. Diane sat at the defense table with her new attorney, Gary Mitchell. No, wait, I can't use Mitchell. Gary Simpson, a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The prosecutor presented the evidence, the same financial records and emails that had destroyed Diane in the divorce proceedings. The judge, Honorable Thomas Wright, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for being tough on white-collar crime, listened carefully. After 40 minutes of testimony, he ruled there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial and set a court date for January. Diane left the courthouse in tears, and I felt nothing. The woman I'd loved was gone, if she'd ever really existed at all. What remained was a stranger who'd made terrible choices and was now facing their consequences. December came, and with it, the holiday season that I'd always loved but now dreaded. I spent Christmas alone in my condo, ordering Chinese food and watching old movies. My family was back in Minnesota, and I couldn't face their pity or their questions. My mother called and I lied, telling her I was swamped with work and couldn't get away. She knew something was wrong but didn't push, and I was grateful for that. New Year's Eve found me at a work party, surrounded by colleagues who were drunk and happy and blissfully unaware of how quickly a life could fall apart. At midnight, I toasted with a glass of champagne and thought about how different my life looked compared to a year ago. Then I went home and slept for 12 hours. The trial began on a freezing Monday in mid-January. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with dated wood paneling and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly. A jury of 12 people, 8 women, 4 men, ranging from early 20s to late 60s, sat in the jury box, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Prosecutor Brennan was methodical, walking them through each fraudulent transfer, each email discussing the transfers, each piece of evidence showing Diane's intent. He called the forensic accountant, Sharon Lee, a woman in her 50s with credentials that took 5 minutes just to read into the record. She testified that the pattern of transfers showed clear premeditation and intent to hide assets. She used charts and graphs showing how the amounts had escalated over time, how they'd been timed to avoid detection, how they'd been disguised as legitimate expenses. Diane's defense was exactly what Brennan had predicted. Gary Simpson argued that she'd had access to the accounts, that marital assets weren't clearly defined, that she'd had no intent to steal because she'd believed the money was as much hers as mine. He painted her as a confused woman in a failing marriage who'd made mistakes but hadn't committed a crime. It might have worked if we hadn't had the emails. Brennan entered them into evidence, and they were devastating. One email to Jonathan read, "Got another $3,000 today. Thinks I donated it to the animal shelter. Idiot doesn't even check the statements." The jury's reaction was visible. Several members visibly recoiled, and one older woman shook her head in disgust. You can't claim confusion when you've documented your own deception in writing. The trial lasted 5 days. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, I was sitting in the gallery with Patricia, my palms sweating despite the cool temperature. The forewoman, a middle-aged black woman who worked as an accountant, stood and read the verdict. Guilty on 4 counts of felony theft, guilty on 2 counts of fraud. Diane's face crumpled and she started crying. Gary Simpson put a hand on her shoulder but looked unsurprised. Judge Wright set sentencing for 6 weeks later and remanded Diane to custody pending a bail hearing. As they led her away in handcuffs, she looked back at me, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been regret or might have been anger. I couldn't tell anymore, and I realized I didn't care. Sentencing day arrived on a Monday in early March, almost exactly 2 years after I'd first seen that message on her laptop. The courtroom was more crowded this time. Some of Diane's family had shown up, her mother and sister sitting in the front row with tissues clutched in their hands. They'd never reached out to me during any of this, never acknowledged what their daughter had done, and I had no sympathy for them now. Judge Wright listened to both attorneys make their arguments. Gary Simpson pleaded for leniency, citing Diane's lack of criminal history, her cooperation with the investigation, her remorse. Brennan argued that the sophisticated nature of the fraud, the extended time period, and the significant amount stolen warranted a serious sentence to serve as deterrence. Judge Wright took off his glasses, looked directly at Diane, and spoke. "Ms. Wells," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "you systematically defrauded your husband over the course of more than a year, stealing significant marital assets while plotting to further victimize him in divorce proceedings. You showed no remorse until you were caught, and even then, your remorse appears to be primarily for your own situation, rather than for the harm you caused. This court sees cases of domestic financial abuse regularly, and they represent a profound violation of trust that this court takes very seriously. I'm sentencing you to 18 months in a minimum security facility, followed by 3 years of probation. You will also be required to pay full restitution of $85,320 plus court costs. I hope you use your time to reflect on the choices that brought you here." 18 months. Diane sobbed as they led her away, her mother crying out from the gallery. I sat there feeling nothing, just a vast, empty space where rage and hurt had been. Patricia leaned over and whispered, "It's over." I nodded. The legal portion was over anyway. The healing would take longer. I walked out of that courthouse into gray Seattle drizzle, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt like I could breathe. That night, I met with David and Patricia at a quiet restaurant to thank them for everything they'd done. David raised his beer and said, "To justice, even when it takes too long to arrive." We drank to that, and I meant it. But I also knew that no sentence, no financial restitution, no legal victory could give me back what Diane had stolen. The ability to trust completely, to love without fear, to believe in the future someone promised you. The months that followed were strange. I threw myself into work, leading a team that successfully launched a major platform upgrade ahead of schedule. My manager submitted me for a leadership development program, which I accepted. I started running again, something I'd abandoned during the worst of the crisis, and found solace in the mindless rhythm of feet on pavement. Dr. Fairbanks continued to be my anchor, helping me process what she called complicated grief, a mourning not just the loss of my marriage, but the loss of who I'd been before I learned what betrayal felt like. I joined a support group for people who'd experienced financial abuse in relationships, and listening to their stories helped me understand I wasn't alone. A woman named Rachel told me something that resonated. They didn't just steal our money or our time. They stole our ability to believe in happy endings. I felt that in my bones. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. You find out what you're made of. And apparently, I was made of sterner stuff than I'd realized. 6 months after Diane's sentencing, I got a promotion to Director of Engineering, a position I'd been working toward for years. I moved into a bigger office with an actual door and windows that didn't face a brick wall. I started dating again, cautiously, with the understanding that I came with substantial baggage. Most first dates ended with awkward goodbyes when I explained why I was divorced. But one woman, Lisa, a data scientist who worked at a biotech firm, surprised me by saying, "My ex cheated too. Different circumstances, but the trust issues are the same. We can figure it out together, or not. Either way, let's at least have a second date." We did, and then a third, and now, 8 months later, I'm cautiously optimistic about where it might go. Diane got released after serving 13 months with good behavior. I found out through Patricia, who'd set up alerts to notify us when she was released. She moved to California, San Diego apparently, working for some marketing firm under her maiden name. I don't follow her life, and I don't care to. She tried to send me a letter once, forwarded through Patricia, and I threw it away without reading it. Whatever she had to say, I didn't need to hear it. Jonathan, meanwhile, lost his medical license permanently after a patient filed a malpractice suit that revealed the extent of his ethical violations during the period of his affair. He works as a consultant for medical device companies now, making a fraction of what he used to earn. Catherine remarried, I heard, to a pediatrician who actually shows up for his kids. Good for her. As for me, I'm still healing. Some days are easier than others. I still have moments where I catch myself wondering what I could have done differently, even though Dr. Fairbanks assures me the answer is nothing. You can't prevent someone from choosing to betray you. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, the knowledge that people can lie to your face and sleep beside you and plot your destruction all at the same time. But I've also learned that surviving that kind of betrayal makes you stronger in ways you didn't expect. I trust my judgment again. I know what red flags look like, and I know that I'm capable of handling whatever comes next, because I've already survived the worst thing I could imagine. There was one final piece to this story, though, something that happened just last week. Patricia called and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. We hadn't spoken in months, as there was no more legal work to be done. I met her at a cafe near her office, and she slid a manila envelope across the table, different from the one I'd given Diane all those months ago, but similar enough to make my heart rate spike. "What's this?" I asked. She smiled, and it was the first time I'd seen her look genuinely pleased. Settlement from Jonathan Whitmore's assets. His ex-wife Catherine filed a civil suit against him for emotional damages related to the affair, and part of the discovery process revealed he'd used marital funds to support his relationship with Diane. Since those funds included money stolen from you, her attorney contacted me. This is your portion of the settlement, $32,000. Not a full recovery, but something. I looked at the check, then at Patricia. I don't want his money, I said. She nodded, like she'd expected that response. Then donate it. Use it for something good. But you earned this, Austin. You fought for yourself when most people would have just rolled over and accepted being a victim. This is the universe acknowledging that. I thought about it, then remembered the support group I'd joined, how they operated on a shoestring budget and helped dozens of people every year. I signed the check over to them that afternoon, every penny. When I told the group coordinator, a counselor named Margaret Foster, she cried and hugged me and said it would fund their programming for the next 2 years. That felt better than any legal victory had. Now, I'm sitting in my condo as I write this, looking out at the Seattle skyline and thinking about how far I've come. It's been 2.5 years since I first saw that message on Diane's laptop, 2 years since I walked out of our house, 18 months since she was sentenced. I'm 38 years old. I have a career I'm proud of. I have friends who actually know what I went through and stuck around anyway. I have a therapist who keeps me grounded, and I have Lisa, who makes me laugh and doesn't run away when I have bad days. It's not the life I planned, but it's a good life, built on a foundation of truth instead of lies. People ask me sometimes if I regret how I handled things, if I wish I'd confronted Diane earlier or tried to work things out. The answer is no. She made her choices over the course of more than a year, systematically and deliberately. I responded by protecting myself and ensuring she faced consequences. Some people think that makes me cold or vengeful. I think it makes me someone who refused to be a victim. And honestly, watching her face as she opened that envelope and realized I knew everything, seeing the exact moment she understood her carefully constructed plan had fallen apart, that was worth every difficult moment that followed. If you're reading this and you're going through something similar, here's what I learned. Document everything. Trust your gut. Get professional help, both legal and psychological. Don't confront until you have all your ducks in a row. And understand that closure doesn't come from them. It comes from you, from choosing to rebuild your life on your own terms. The person who betrayed you doesn't get to write the ending to your story. You do. The manila envelope I slid across the table to Diane that day in Patricia's office contained more than just evidence of her affair and fraud. It contained the proof that I wasn't the clueless husband she thought I was, that I'd been 10 steps ahead of her the entire time, that every smile I'd given her while knowing the truth was part of a larger strategy. It contained the message that she'd underestimated me, and that underestimation had cost her everything: her marriage, her career, her reputation, her freedom, and her future with Jonathan. When she opened that envelope and started reading, I watched her understand all of this in real time, watched her realize that the life she'd planned with him would never happen, because I'd burned it all down with the truth. That moment, sitting across from her in that conference room, watching her world collapse as mine had collapsed, that was the gift I gave her, the gift of consequences, the gift of understanding that actions matter and betrayal has a price. And judging by the look on her face, she finally, truly understood what that envelope really meant. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.